So let me start that. So I'm Ann Lavelle. We're talking about the ADA today. I am the compliance specialist for CTR. In a prior life, I practiced law as a partner in a very large law firm doing management side, labor and employment law for almost a quarter of a century, and that was enough for me. And so I really always enjoyed doing the educational component, the trainings for employers and whatnot. So I enjoy these sessions. And for those of you who know me, feel free to put a question in the Q&A at any time. We will answer the questions to the best we can. If we start to get off track time-wise, I might save the questions to the end, and then we'll do those as well, but we will get to them. So any question, it'll make it a better learning experience if you share the questions that you have. And so I'm not always an electronic or technical genius here, but there we go. I got the slide advanced. This is being recorded. Most of you know that. You will get the copy and the slide deck sent to you along with the SHRM code if you need this. This is always good for 1 hour of SHRM credit. So if you are SHRM certified, it's an easy 1 hour probably. So you'll get that. Everybody's on mute, but we do have the Q&A open. Please put any questions, comments, whatever in there. And the other thing I want to let you know, since a lot of you join me every month, and I really appreciate that. Sometimes I don't know why anybody tunes in to listen to me, but I appreciate it. Next month, we are not doing a webinar. We're doing a seminar. And so because of all the executive orders, which you've probably heard about unless you're, living under a rock or something, which sometimes that can be better anyway. But there is a slew of executive orders out there, and we always stay apolitical. So this is not about whether those executive orders are the best things in sliced bread or the worst things in sliced bread. This is about how it will affect you. So next month, March 19th, so it's not going to be a Thursday, it's going to be a Wednesday at the Regional Learning Alliance up in Cranberry. We're going to be talking about those executive orders. There's lunch. It'll be a 2-hour SHRM credit. And so if you want to attend, just put it on your calendar, and there are invites going out. And so hopefully that will help, because I know there's just a lot of confusion in all sorts of areas, but especially employment, about where do we stand with all these different executive orders coming out? What does it mean for us? Especially if we're a federal contractor or something like that, what does that mean? But private employers as well. So we'll be covering those executive orders, which will be sure to change, I'm sure, between now and then, but we'll cover them and talk about what it means to you as an employer. So hopefully I'll see you all there. All right. So let's start out with just being real. The ADA is tough. There's just no two ways about it. And I think one of the reasons it's particularly difficult for employers is it's so broad. It covers so many things that you have to keep track of. And a lot of employers look at it and all you think about is reasonable accommodation. But we're going to go over sort of 5 tips or 5 mistakes not to make, maybe, depending on how you look at it. And by background here, we should know the ADA really has 3 parts to it. So when we're looking at the ADA, and it overlaps with a lot of laws too, and we don't have time today to go over every single law it overlaps with. So we're just focusing on the ADA. We have first and foremost design accessibility, and employers don't usually think about that when they think about training their employees or anything else. I want to point one thing out, because I know we have some churches online today. And by church, that's a term that's used legally to encompass any religious organization. So church, synagogue, temple, mosque, whatever. You actually are exempt from the design accessibility standards under the ADA. And so that can be a benefit to you. If you don't have elevators and whatnot, you don't probably care, because under the ADA, you don't have to. Now, there could be, from your standpoint, maybe ethical reasons why you want to do it, moral reasons why you'd want to comply, but you actually are not covered by the design standards under the ADA. But local state governments, I know we have some schools on here and some state government type organizations, you're covered by this, and all private employers are basically covered. There's also, beyond the design standards, and we'll talk about why you should care about that as an employer and not just if you're an architect, we have the prohibition on discrimination. And so under the ADA, as well as other laws, you can't discriminate based on an actual disability. That makes sense, right? You also can't discriminate, and this is a little different, on a perceived or regarded as disability, or a history of a disability, or being related to somebody that has a disability. So we'll get into that a little bit as well, because sometimes that sort of gets forgotten about. The ADA, and this is what everybody thinks about who's an employer, covers any employer with 15 or more employees and requires you to reasonably, and we'll talk about what reasonable means, because that's often the source of litigation, accommodate a physical or mental disability. In Pennsylvania, I want to point out, and different states have different thresholds. If you're sitting there saying, gosh, whew, I can tune in out for the rest of the hour here because I only have 10 employees. Well, in Pennsylvania, we have the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act that covers employers with 4 or more employees. And it mimics or mirrors the ADA as well as the other federal laws on employment discrimination. So even if you're very tiny in this state, and even if different things happen at the federal level, which we'll talk about those executive orders next month, we'll talk a little bit about it today, we still have Pennsylvania's laws hanging out there, and nothing at the federal level affects those state laws. So we could get rid of the ADA tomorrow. That's not happening, but we could. We still have the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, the PHRA. We'd still have disability accommodation issues, discrimination issues, et cetera, in this state, as in most states. Okay. So let's talk about sort of the first issue here, or the first tip, or the first thing not to do. The design standards, right? And really, this is a training issue. A lot of the ADA is a training issue with respect to employees. I have harped on this before, and I sound like a broken record, but it's probably because I've handled hundreds of cases where it's the first level supervisor who made the misstep that got the organization in trouble. And it's almost always unintentional by the first level supervisor. And it's really not his or her fault. It's really more an issue of they didn't know what they didn't know. So the first way you can get in trouble here, and the first thing we ought to think about, is the EEOC has issued an ADA primer for small businesses. And I've stolen some of their language here. What's true for small businesses is obviously going to be true for larger businesses as well. But the ADA is thinking, hey, even if you just have one employee working in your store, and they say this in the primer, you still should be thinking about this. So you could have a very small organization, very small store or warehouse or reception area or whatever. You only got one person sitting around. And the EEOC thinks, well, you should still have that person, unless there's some sort of safety risk, out there retrieving items for somebody who might be disabled, helping a blind person maneuver through the store, helping a customer with an intellectual disability read product labels or instructions, or allowing a second person in a dressing room. The EEOC views these as sort of what I'll call no-brainer accommodations, that you should be doing this, your employees should be trained, right? Not just your supervisors, but all employees should be trained that if Ann Lavelle walks in and says, hey, I need help for some reason, that we ought to be thinking about, gosh, how do we help? And especially if my disability is obvious, right? I have a daughter who is blind. She uses a white cane. Her disability is obvious. She walks into a store, she's going to need help. It's obvious what the issue is. But that's what your employees should be trained for. And you can see the link there to the small business ADA.gov is where you can find that primer at, and you can read through it. It talks about other things, but those are some basic issues that most employers who have a front-facing side to them with the public need to have their employees trained on. The other thing that they need to know is if they've got an issue going, that they need to run it up the chain of command, right? That means their supervisor, HR, whoever it is, they need to know. I'll tell you the issues that we ran into the most on this from a litigation standpoint when I practice is stocking or displays. So your aisles have to be a certain distance. And sometimes you have employees who start unloading a carton and leave it there because they get busy with something else. That's a problem. Or they put up a display because it looks really, really nice in that particular corner. But the issue is the wheelchair can't get past. Entrances, particularly in this, if it's older buildings, some of them are grandfathered in, but a lot of them use bells. And then, like in the South Side, they'll bring out a ramp and they'll put the ramp there if there's a wheelchair customer, and that way they can get in. Not having that type of system, if you're in a situation where your building's not easily accessible, or having a situation where you don't respond to the bell or your employees blow it off for whatever reason, those are litigation issues. Parking spaces. So let's talk about this for a second, because I've seen this litigated from two different ways. One is an employee has an issue and has a handicap tag. But you say, hey, those spaces are reserved for customers. Can you do that? No. If that employee has a handicap tag, it's very difficult to make the argument that, hey, those spaces are only for our customers, and employees have to park in that like back lot that's like 2 miles away and walk. It just doesn't work that way. You have to bend your rules and let them park. I just had the flip side of this occur. For something else that I do, where the business had a lot that was an employee only lot, and that's where the only handicap spaces were. And a customer wanted to park in the handicap spot because their child was disabled, and the business said no. That's a problem as well, because again, you have to bend your rules. The handicap parking spaces are there for a reason. You also have to make sure you have the right number of handicap parking spaces. So that may be a little outside of the HR's bailiwick, but that is something just to be aware of. If you have employees saying, hey, I want a handicap spot, and you don't have any in your parking lot, you probably have violated the ADA. Or if you don't have enough of them, that's probably a problem as well. Okay, so a lot of employers don't think about this aspect of the ADA. They're only thinking about the reasonable accommodation, but it's out there. It's something that employees should at least be trained on to recognize and run it up the flagpole if there's an issue going on or a customer shows up and says, hey, I need X, Y, and Z. All right, myth or reality? A little break here. I heard it through the grapevine, and we know that has to be reliable, that this law will be history thanks to a slew of new executive orders. So not yet. There has been no executive order come out that has demolished this, and it would be difficult. An executive order, theoretically, cannot undo a law. So this is still good law. It's still being enforced. And even if somehow at the federal law level, this would go sideways, or an order would get issued attempting to undo this law, we still have the state, right? And we live in a state that isn't necessarily red all the time. And I'm not being political. It's just we don't always fall into line with red or blue policy. There's been no indication in our state that even if the ADA or Section 504, which is another disability law that's getting a lot of attention out there, goes away, we still have the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. If you're in Pittsburgh, there's a similar act that's at the city level. So we're not losing this anytime soon. Okay. Another sort of tip or mistake to avoid is recognizing what is or isn't a disability, and knowing that an actual disability is not required to be protected under this law. So the one that everybody thinks of, right, is we look at the person who has an employee who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I'm protected if I have a history of a disability. So Anne has had cancer. She's protected, right? And we'll talk about why this comes up and usually the ugly situation that it comes in. Or I'm perceived by others because I have some sort of perhaps deformity or whatever it is. The example that the ADA uses is a person who has scars from a severe burn, but more often it's age-related infirmities. We think Anne, because she's so old, and I am getting old. You know, I think it's dementia at this point. Stuff like that occurs in the workplace where somebody is labeled with a disability that they may not have. So where does this come up? Oftentimes. So whether it's a history or record of, or I'm just perceived to have a disability because I'm kind of forgetful. And I will admit to that. I'm the one who lost my car keys 2 days ago because I put them in my trunk. In any event, where I have seen this pop up, where it gets really ugly, is, hey, Anne had cancer. She's going to kill our health insurance rates. And we can't have her having more cancer on our health plan. We don't want that. That'll really do it for our plan. And yes, health plans are super expensive. However, not only under the ADA, but under ERISA, which controls health plans, you can't make decisions about me, including booting me off the health plan because of some sort of history of disability or history of having high claims or whatever it is, or having a child with high claims. So real life scenario, had a company that had a father on the plan who had a kid with tons and tons and tons of issues. Also, real life situation, had a employee who had a liver transplant, super duper expensive. Both of those situations, the employer made the decision, even though those two people were capable of working, no issues with respect to that they were concerned that those people would cause their health plan prices to skyrocket. Some truth in that, right? However, terminating somebody because of that concern is a perceived as disability, because you don't know that my cancer will return. You don't know if my kid, who maybe was a preemie and had tons and tons, by the way, preemies are the most expensive healthcare claim out there usually, whether they'll be fantastic in the future, not having claims, or continue to have claims. Same thing with the liver transplant recipient. And so those employers, if they fired the employee, that's disability discrimination. One of them got the bright idea that instead of firing the person, they had some sympathy. And so they decided that instead, what they would do is offer the person some cash or a different individual policy rather than letting them on the group health plan, because they didn't want them affecting the group health rates for everybody. That is also disability discrimination, and it's also disability discrimination under ERISA. You cannot make decisions about your health plan based on somebody's usage of that health plan, or your perception of how they'll use it based on what you know about their kid or their own health history or whatever it might be. Some of the real evils that come out of that, and some of you may be saying, I didn't tune in for a health plan primer, but this is really important. If you have a discriminatory plan, and this can happen in a number of ways, but this is one of them, the benefits under the plan can become taxable. And I don't mean the premiums. I mean your CEO has a quadruple bypass and his bill is over 6 figures from the hospital. That 6-figure bill, if you have a discriminatory health plan in certain circumstances, can become taxable income to him or her. So you do not want to play around with this, even though I definitely understand the pain of affording health insurance on a group level, and the concern of trying to keep it reasonable for all the employees, and the concern about one employee or one employee's family running up the bill. But the law ties our hands. We just can't do things like that. The other way this comes up is some sort of joke by somebody. And unfortunately, workplaces, you want it to be a little social. You don't want it to be completely harsh and sterile. But sometimes people don't realize that the jokes or comments they're making are a problem. And let's talk about that a little bit. So, association or related to claims, that is if somebody's related to someone who has a disability. Doesn't necessarily have to be a close relative. I could stand up for a coworker. I could say, hey, what you're doing to Joe, who had the liver transplant, isn't right. Now I'm protected. It could be because I have that daughter who's blind. I have an association with somebody who's disabled. Again, it often involves a joke or the healthcare insurance cost overlap. And some of you may have heard this case, but it made the national news for Western Pennsylvania. But there was a Pittsburgh Mills Mall that's out north, going way up 28. It was a Chili's restaurant, and the employee was the father to a 6-month-old child who had Down syndrome. And two of what had to be stellar coworkers called the child a retard. And obviously, that's derogatory. We don't use that term these days. And the employee complained to the manager and said, I'm not going to tolerate that. They can't call my kid that. And the manager, who clearly wasn't trained, said, well, you can leave then. Guess what restaurant got sued and made the national news for doing that one? There's so many problems here, right? It shows a lack of training of the coworkers. It shows a lack of training by the manager. The manager should have at least run it up the flagpole. This employee may have had other issues, and there was discussion that they had other disciplinary issues, but that is not the issue here. The issue is he has made a complaint that isn't associated as claim that's protected under the ADA. Okay, so somebody's asking a question. Let me just finish the slide and then I will get to that question. It's also retaliation, right? I have made a complaint, this employee made a complaint about arguably discrimination with respect to his disabled son, and the manager told him he can leave. Retaliation. Retaliation is often worse than the actual claim, because in this situation, if the restaurant had disciplined those two stellar workers who decided to use that word, they likely could have avoided or been successful in defending any litigation, because people do dumb things, courts recognize that, but if you remediate it immediately, then you can avoid the claim or defend the claim. So if they had disciplined those two workers who said those things, they'd have been so much better positioned. But as it is, the way they handled it, probably due to a lack of training, they had both a claim and a retaliation claim because of the termination. Okay, somebody's asking a question. I'm going to read it here. It says, how do we terminate an employee that has not responded to us? I am shocked to learn that employees don't respond to you guys. Or given us any update on his mental condition since the middle of November, and he was scheduled to return to work at the end of November, but never showed or returned. So we would need to know more information. One thing, we're only talking about the ADA today. We would need to know if he was FMLA qualifying and whether he had exhausted his FMLA leave. But for our purposes, let's pretend that he has, and that the only issue we've got going here is the ADA. The fact that he hasn't been terminated yet, I think you guys have been generous, assuming we've run the FMLA. He has an affirmative responsibility to communicate with us. Having said that, though, the way we typically frame these, because you always have to look at this in terms of how do I defend a claim? I can't avoid a claim, so hopefully I have employment practices liability insurance. I'm going to send out a notice. So in an ideal world, which I know we very rarely have, but maybe for the future. If he's supposed to return November 17th, 10 days before then, or I'm sorry, he's supposed to return November 26th, 10 days before then, I would have sent a letter, probably regular and certified mail, and said, hey, especially if I thought he was a problem, hey, Joe, we have you scheduled to return November 26th. Can you please confirm that you're going to do that? Or if you need something, let us know. And then if he didn't respond, I would send another letter and say, hey, you haven't responded, and we told you to respond by whatever date, reasonable date we put in there. This is your second bite of the apple, essentially, because I want to look reasonable in front of a jury, and I think that's the right ethical thing to do as well. And so, hey, here's your second bite of the apple. You ignored us back in November. And so it's now November 26th. We haven't seen you. And if you don't respond to us and give us a status update, at least by X date, and I would make it much shorter, then your employment's going to be terminated. Again, we've given him not one, but two bites of the apple there. We've sent one out. And again, this may not have happened, but in an ideal world, this is what we would do. And this is assuming that we don't have an FMLA, or the FMLA has run, or he's not eligible, or he's not eligible for any other leave laws out there like the city of Pittsburgh. And we're going to say, hey, you're done. But we'll document it. We will be ethical as an employer. We'll do the right thing. We'll give him a warning. We'll give him a second warning, and then we terminate. If we're at a position at this point where we've never sent him a letter, then, I mean, I think you're well advised to talk to counsel about this, but I would be looking at this and saying, okay, I may have let the boat sail a little bit back in November, and we've got somebody who's sort of just lingering out there, and assuming we don't have FMLA overlap or workers' comp or something that we need to look at a little further, or the city of Pittsburgh leave or something, although that should have been exhausted long ago. I would probably do the letters now and say, hey, we haven't heard from you since who knows when, and we need an update, or we're done, sort of thing. You could be more aggressive at this point and just say, hey, you knew you were supposed to return by November 26th. We haven't heard from you. And again, assuming no FMLA or other overlap, you're done. But if you want to do that more aggressive stance, I would definitely talk to counsel first, because you want to make sure you're treating this guy the same as you have with anybody else. So if you've let other people sort of hang out there longer, that's something to look at too, to make sure you're treating him the same as like Ann Lavelle, who hung out there, for 4 or 5 months and didn't do anything either. So something to think about. So I hope that helps to answer your question. That's a great example, a real life example. I would always I don't want to say set them up, because that's not really what I'm trying to do. I want to set them up for success. So I'm putting them on notice about 10 days before they return that we expect them back, but if they need more help, to let us know. And then if they don't respond by whatever date I've given them, I'm going to give them a second bite of the apple, because I want to look reasonable in front of the jury, unless I want to be really aggressive for some reason. And when they don't respond, then I'm done, because they have an affirmative obligation. They've been warned twice, and we're just done. Okay, hopefully that helps. All right. So, okay, I think I covered everything there. All right, this third sort of tip on that is failure to engage in the interactive process. And so the question we just had is a great example of the documentation that I'm looking for when I practiced. I'm looking for documentation that we have reached out, that we have been fair, that a jury of the employees' peers, not your peers, is going to look at us and say, gosh, they tried. So sort of the third tip is making sure you recognize when you need to start the interactive process. And this is where most cases fail. So you have a worker who says, my back is killing me. I just unloaded the supply truck. And the first level supervisor tells Joe to quit complaining, usually not that politely. Do we have an issue here? If I were the supervisor and I had been trained appropriately, we probably have two issues here. Do we have a workers' comp claim would be my first issue. They don't have to use any magic words. And then do I have an issue where I need to talk to this guy about whether he has a medical problem. The first level supervisor should be running this up the flagpole so that we can start the interactive process. Similarly, what if the employee comes to you and says, hey, I have problem, whatever, but I don't have a solution for the problem? That's still the interactive process, because even though the employee may have zero solution for the problem, and even if it looks to you like there's zero solution for the problem, and this again is a real life example, the messenger. So Messenger is downtown in Pittsburgh. They're walking all over creation. This was for another law firm. And the messenger, who ran back and forth to the courthouse all day long for court filings and whatever, had plantar fasciitis. And if you've ever had that, that's definitely painful. It probably qualifies as a disability. Basically, his whole job was walking. And he said, I don't know what to do. I just can't walk anymore. And his job's dependent on walking. What do we do with that? We'll talk about that in a little bit here. Or if the employee comes to you and says, I have problem XYZ, and I know the accommodation I want, and you as HR say, oh, we have been down the path of Joe and his back problems and whatnot many times, and all of his colleagues. And so we don't give Ann the accommodation she wants because we already know what accommodation we're giving. All that can be problematic under the interactive process. All of that would show a failure to engage in the interactive process, which means you lose the lawsuit because you didn't engage in any of these three situations with the interactive process. So what is the interactive process? Forgive me while I take a drink here. Step one, recognize. Get somebody to recognize what it is, right? And so these tips, and some of them come straight from the EEOC, is they're saying, hey, if you get a questionable thing, like my back is killing me, you should err on the side of requesting clarification, right? So in Joe's case, we ought to be asking a question, maybe not his supervisor, that's probably not the right person, but HR should be asking the question because the supervisor should have reported it. What's going on? How can we help you? We don't have to lead with our chin. We don't have to be like, hey, we are covered by the ADA and there's all sorts of accommodations we can offer you and blah, blah, blah. It can be a very open-ended conversation just to get more information to make sure Joe's okay. Acting quickly. We would get cases where the employer had tried to put in an accommodation, but wasn't sure what to do. And time gets away and you're busy with other fires. And so 3 months later, there's still no accommodation, and now you're getting sued. You really need to move on these. That sort of dragging your feet because you don't know what to do is a problem. Assign responsibility, and you may not be large enough. You may be like, hey, I wear every single hat in this organization, and it's all my responsibility. But the employee should know who is handling this, especially if you have more than one HR person. And that person should take ownership of it. Conduct training, right? Those first level supervisors, make sure Joe's supervisor knows what's going on and to run it up the flagpole. The best thing that supervisors can do is run it up the flagpole. If they have any question in their mind, I mean, that's the training, really. You have any question in your mind, run it up the flagpole. Let somebody else make the decision. Number two, gather the information. So let's talk about that a little bit. You can't have an interactive process without talking to the employee. If you're not talking to the employee, you're going to fail the interactive process here. And again, most lawsuits fail in the interactive process stage because employers don't do a good job of it. Get the information, find out what's going on. Usually the employee can tell you. Now, I fully understand that sometimes you can't trust that employee or you have doubts about what they are saying or doing. We can handle that. But for most employees, we're going to find out what's going on. We can get some medical documentation, and I highly recommend that. But we're not going to ask for the employee's entire record. I had a case once where the employer had asked for all of their records because they were looking for prior problems. They thought this lady was a problem. She was a problem child, but They asked for her records from the time she was like 20 and she was now like 50, including all of her obstetric records. And trust me, the issue had nothing to do with her delivery of any children. That is overreaching, right? I think most of us could agree on that. But we're really saying, hey, the law only allows us to get the essential information. We're going to find out if we have doubts about the veracity of the information or whether it's accurately representing the person's condition or anything like that. There's avenues that we can go down, right? If this is concurrent with FMLA, we can get a second opinion, right? We can get clarification. I've had companies send out private investigators to see if the person's behavior was consistent with what they were saying. Those second opinions are at our expense, and that's okay. Because if we truly have someone that we think is setting us up or doing something that is really slimy, that's a highly technical legal word, they are the right person to invest our money in to try to see if we're right about them and to take disciplinary action. Because we as an employer want to give the benefits to those who deserve it and hold the feet to the fire of those who are taking us for a ride. And we invest our money in the folks that, I shouldn't say invest, but we invest for our company in pursuing the ones that are a problem that we think are bordering on fraud or something like that. That's where we focus our attention. We don't focus on the person who's had the heart and lung transplant. And I had a client do that one time. We'll talk about that story in a second. We had another question come in. We have an employee that lives on property in an employer-owned apartment. Okay, she has difficulties getting into the bathtub. Are we as responsible to accommodate this? So the question to that, or the answer to that question, and that's a great question because let's take it a little bit more broadly. We have an employee who, as part of their job, and I'm going to assume that living on the property is part of the job requirement, that this isn't just some perk that we threw out to her. A physical modification of our job space, whether that's the apartment or whether that's I'm working on the floor of a plant and I need something, is required under the ADA if it's reasonable. So assuming in this situation, great question, that this employee is required because maybe this is a home for intellectually disabled individuals or a senior citizen home, or I'm almost there, or whatever it might be. I've had too much caffeine today. And we require them to live there, right? And we may have sleep time issues and all sorts of things like that. Then the answer is going to be yes, we are responsible for the modification, even if the area, the warehouse, the apartment, whatever it is, might be grandfathered in under the ADA because we haven't remodeled it or done anything since 1990 with it. So if they aren't required to live there, we would need more information. That was a follow-up question, but let me finish my thoughts here on the first one. Real life case, we had an employee that worked for a government entity, and they had to cross like a concrete barrier to get to where their job space was. So from the parking lot to the job space, they had to cross a concrete barrier, and they wanted sort of like a wheelchair path put in for that. That's a reasonable accommodation, even though that was kind of expensive, but we're talking about a government entity that was quite large. And so for them, even though that might be a $15,000 accommodation, that was reasonable to put this little path in for this person to get from the handicapped spot over to where their little hub was to work. So the follow-up question is here is, what if they aren't required to live there? So you have you're running this apartment somehow, presumably. And so even if they're not required to live there, I would start looking then at whether or not the design and architecture is appropriate for this person. So there's a lot there to unpack. If they're not required, but you're still getting some benefit out of them living there, I mean, I kind of would question why they would be in this apartment if there's no benefit to you. And so if they're getting some benefit, then I think you probably are looking at a modification. If you own this apartment and they're living there, but nobody knows why they're living there, I guess, I would still be looking at this under a Title III, assuming you're not a government employer, to see whether or not there's any design modifications that need to be made. So I don't think you're sort of like off the hook automatically here. I think there's a good chance, especially if they're either required or you're getting some benefit out of them living there, that you may have to make some accommodation. And I don't know what the accommodation would be, whether that's a full scale, I'm going to put a walk-in shower in, or what it might be, but that might need to be looked at. So probably need some more information there as to why they're living there and how you own it and different things like that. All right, privacy rules. So this got messed up all the time. And when the EEOC is investigating one of these claims, 99.9999% of the time, they ask to see the personnel file and the medical file. And so many times what would get handed over to the EEOC from the employer was a single file. That's completely wrong. And the EEOC would get upset about it every single time. And then I'd get an earful when we stepped in, because usually by this time the horse was out of the barn and running around the back 40 somewhere. And the employer who thought, oh, we'll handle this ourselves, was all of a sudden like, maybe we shouldn't handle this ourselves. You cannot do that. You must have separate files, whether that's a paper file, electronic file with different access to it, whatever it is. Medical information, whether that's the FMLA paperwork, the ADA doctor's note, whatever it is, must be kept in a separate file. And again, with electronic files, that looks a little different than a paper file, but you need to do something. Okay, somebody just asked, any specific requirements for digital files? So the requirement is quite basic, because remember, the ADA came into effect in 1990, kind of back in the dark ages when I grew up. No, actually, I was pretty old in 1990. In any event, so they don't have like, hey, you must encrypt it and you must do this and you must do that and whatever. The requirement is basic. It needs to be kept separate and apart from the personnel file. So all medical information, not just the ADA stuff, anything you can think of, little doctor slips, whatever, has to be kept separate and apart. And you have to limit access to only the individuals who have a need to know. And so that's often more than HR. Oftentimes there's a supervisor or somebody involved. How you accomplish that is up to you. But it is your affirmative responsibility to ensure that you do accomplish that. So there is nothing like, oh, you need 128-bit encryption or whatever. And I don't do technical stuff, so I'm completely making this up. You need to do something though. Okay, great question. All right. Let me get back to my screen here. Explore accommodation options. So the employee can definitely suggest something. The employee's doctor can suggest that. Sometimes if we're stuck, that's a good one. Hey, what does your doctor say, right? And don't forget, an accommodation can be a transfer to an available job. So our messenger who couldn't walk, guess what? They had available jobs that he could do that were within his skill set, because they had a lot of like typing in information in a computer. They were what I'll call a large blue car, green car, red car, whatever type of firm. They had a lot of information that they could type in and do things. So that didn't require any walking, really. That is always something we have to look at, is whether or not there's an open job within their qualifications. There's also a place called JAN, and that's the Job Accommodation Network. It's basically free to employers. You can brainstorm with them. Now, I will say my experience is that they are employee friendly. But again, ethically, we're not trying to stick it to our employee who wants an accommodation. And from our own sort of protective stance, aren't we better to look like we tried? That we didn't leave any rock unturned to try to see what accommodations might be out there? Okay. Choose an accommodation. And I think this last tip is particularly important. You can do trial periods. People seem to think, oh, I'm one and done. I'm going to pick this accommodation. And if it doesn't work, life is done. No, we can have a trial period. We can say, okay, we're going to put the messenger in the data entry pool with everybody else, and we'll see how it goes. We'll check in 4 weeks or 3 weeks or 2 weeks, whatever it is. We're going to give him a chance. We're going to give him some training, make sure he knows what he's doing. And we'll see if it's working out for him and for us. You know, if he's terrible at it, we thought he could do it, but he's terrible at it. That doesn't necessarily mean we fire him at that point. It means we look to see if there's anything else. We can have a trial period. It is a wonderful tool, and it's not utilized nearly enough by employers to say, we're going to do this, we're going to try it out, we're going to see what happens. Maybe it'll work for him, maybe it won't, but we'll see what happens. All right. Implement, talk to the person, see how it's going. We don't want them to feel like they're an island onto themselves. Inform your supervisors. We don't have to tell our supervisor every little detail of Anne's medical problem. And I always pick on myself so that I'm not insulting anybody. But we have to let our supervisors know, hey, Anne can't walk, right? So she's going to be doing the data entry. Or Anne hurt her back, right? And Anne can now not lift more than 10 pounds. And therefore, we're going to put her over here on this line in the assembly section rather than unloading the truck. Or we're going to take that duty off of her. She doesn't have to unload the supply truck anymore. And instead, we're going to have Bob do it. And that always raises the question because guaranteed, Bob is teed off. Bob wants to know why Joe doesn't have to unload the monthly supply truck. And really, if it's a monthly supply truck, it's probably difficult to argue that that's an essential function because it only happens once a month. And now Bob gets to do it by himself. He's really pleased. What do you say to Bob? You are prohibited by law from telling Bob that, gosh, Anne or Joe or whoever injured their back and can't do it, and we have to make this accommodation under the ADA and blah, blah, blah. The only thing that you can tell Bob is, who has to pick up the slack in his view, is that we have to do this. We're legally required to do it. And that's the right comment. Let Bob read into that what he will. Bob also has to know he can't retaliate. Okay, so Bob may be really teed off about the whole situation. That's tough cookies. I understand why he's teed off, but it is what it is. And the law requires us, and that's what we've communicated to him, is the law requires this, and we are following the federal law. Last but not least, you know, we're sort of saying, hey, we're going to keep communicating about this. I know we're sort of running short on time here. We're going to maintain the accommodation. And if we have equipment that's part of the accommodation, so I've seen this with talk to text, a secretary who needed that. We're going to look and see if there's updates, additional things, better things maybe that come down the line to do that, whatever it might be. If they need a special seat, whatever it is, things wear out. We're going to check back in. We're going to make sure it's going well. All right. Let's talk about this because this is really important. And we've got about 10 minutes left. Not 10 minutes late yet. 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure I'm thoughtful about everybody's time here. The most common thing I would hear is we're not going to do the accommodation. It's too expensive. That is the single worst answer you can give a court. Because if you say that the accommodation is too expensive, they will say, okay, you have now put all of your finances at issue. And we're going to see what other stupid stuff you spent money on. Because you just said, I can't afford this. And it's $1,000 or it's $5,000 or whatever it is. And so what else did you spend $1,000 or $5,000 on that looks pretty stupid? And the answer is, I can almost guarantee you have spent that much money on something stupid that the court will pick on. Another one is, so that's like the last ditch effort. It's too expensive. You want to go through any other undue hardship that you can possibly have before you reach the conclusion it's too expensive, because that's the worst offense you can get to one of these claims. The other one I hear is, well, if I do it for Anne, Everybody's going to want it. Nobody's going to want to unload the supply truck. Well, yes, there is a floodgate issue. And in the supply truck case, when Bob says, I have a back problem now, I don't want to do it either, wink, 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 he's the one we're going to hold the feet to the fire, because presumably Joe was telling us the truth. We had no reason to doubt him, or Ann was telling us the truth. But Joe, or Bob, getting them confused, is just doing it to yank our chain, and because he doesn't want to do the truck. And he's the one we invest the money on, in sort of holding his feet to the fire to see whether it's true, which it probably isn't in that scenario, and what we can do to sort of ferret out the fraud that might be there. The other one that I've seen that's a combination of this, which was one of the saddest cases we got, and it actually wasn't my case, but because it was so bad, it became a topic of discussion in our group, was a company that had an employee who had a heart-lung transplant. Just in case anybody's wondering, that's a disability. No question about it. Your ability to pump blood and your ability to breathe are essential to living. And the lady was able to return to work. Amazing, right? And she said, well, I can only return to work if I have humidified air. I need a humidifier in my office. She had her own office space. And the company said, we're not buying a humidifier. That's crazy. That's your problem, not ours. Now, that's their first mistake, right? Do you know how much a humidifier is? Maybe a couple hundred. Like, if you're getting the top of the line, this is just crazy. If you think about denying that I won't buy you a humidifier, think about how much you're going to spend on attorney's fees. So even if you bought the top of the line humidifier, way cheaper than litigating this case. Plus, you sound pretty heartless, right? So then she said, oh, okay, I'll bring in my own humidifier. I'll just plug it in. What did they say? No, we can't have you bringing in your own humidifier, because if you bring in your own humidifier, everybody else is going to want one, which like blew my mind, because I can't imagine that many people are requesting humidifiers in their workplace. And think about the electrical bill if we do that. Guaranteed, whatever the increase in electricity costs, even if the whole office had humidifiers, pales in comparison to the 6 figures they spent defending a terrible case and us trying to settle it for them because they sounded like jerks. And so you got to be thoughtful about how you look and how, is this accommodation really that expensive when you compare it to legal fees? And how do you look to a jury if you've just told the person who had the heart-lung transplant, no? This is important too. And I see I have more questions. I'm going to hold the questions to the end here, just because we only have 5 minutes left and I want to be respectful of everybody's time, but I will get to them, I promise you. It requires us to bend our rules. Their rules are facially neutral, we're not breaking them. That is the wrong answer. The expectation under the ADA is that you have rules, and this law requires you to bend or break them if necessary, if it's reasonable. Some laws aren't, some rules like workplace violence, no, we're never going to bend that. We're never going to break that. We are not going to allow somebody who punches a supervisor back into our workplace, even if he says he has a mental disorder. He's done, or she's done. But attendance rules, what I have in my workspace, different things like that. I want that humidifier, whatever it might be. Those are the types of rules that we will bend or break to comply if it's not an undue hardship. The other one I hear is they're a terrible employee. They're taking me for a ride. I just know it. We have ways to address that, but that's not a reason to deny the accommodation. In fact, I've heard a number of EEOC investigators speak at conferences. Their expectation, whether it's an ADA case or some type of discrimination case, is that the employee is a bad employee according to the employer, and that they will have had all sorts of discipline and other issues, because if things were going well and you were complying with the law, they wouldn't have discipline. But if you're not complying with the law, there's going to be discipline. So the EEOC investigators' expectation is we probably have an employee with lots of discipline issues and other things because you, employer, set them up for it. So be aware that just because the employee looks awful on paper, because they've had, they're in the progressive discipline and they're right at the top of about what's to happen, we don't deny the accommodation because of that. We may investigate the accommodation request because of that, but we don't deny it. Okay. Retaliation, talked about this. The Chili's guy, right? It's often worse than the actual claim. Oftentimes we can control the underlying claim, but when you get retaliation because people are teed off, like Bob, who has to unload the supply truck and is now making comments about Ann being too old of a geezer or gimpy or whatever, we now have a retaliation claim that we can't defend well. Failure to promote or retain. If you have somebody who's had an ADA accommodation and they're about to be terminated, my advice to you is to talk to legal counsel first. It may be the right decision, right? We don't have to keep everybody who's ever had an accommodation, but that's such a frequent scenario where we have somebody who has or had a history of an accommodation, and now for some reason we're letting them go. They will look at that, the employee will look at that and say, well, but for the fact that I had an accommodation a year ago, they've never liked me since then. And really, this is retaliation. And watch the communications, whether that's internal work communications or the Facebook post that somebody finds out about that says, you know, Bob says, I really work with a loser. Ann Lavelle is just the worst. And she doesn't pull her weight. And, you know, I can't stand that my employer has gimpy people and whatever. You find out about that. I don't care that it's a communication outside of the workplace. We're going to address it with Bob. So just be aware of those things. All right, solutions. These are kind of obvious. We've kind of talked about it. Train, not the choo-choo. Train your first level supervisors, run it up the flagpole. If you're not sure in HR, guaranteed an hour or two of preventive medicine with labor counsel, not just a generalist, but employment counsel, is well worth the investment. The things that made us cringe the most when we got them were cases where the horse was already out of the barn, running around the back 40, and we were trying to pick up the pieces. Document, especially the interactive process. Do I have answers for each of those steps? Are they documented? Ideally, if I'm large enough, I'm going to have witnesses to this too when I have conversations with him or her. The accommodation may fail. You may truly be set up for something here, but this is your defense, right? Your paper trail is your defense, and you have to look reasonable. We always want to be ethical, and we want to follow the law. Have a clear policy regarding the accommodations and retaliation. So if Ann thinks she's being retaliated against by Bob, who keeps calling her gimpy, who does Ann go to, right? And ideally, there should be two people, because what if Bob's one of the supervisors who's calling her gimpy, and her only option is to go to Bob and complain about him to him? It doesn't work out so well. So be sure you have at least two people in that policy who do know what they're doing, more than just running it up the flagpole, and can handle or at least address or tell the employee, we'll get back to you if an issue arises. Okay, there's some contact information. I'm going to answer the question here that came in. It says, we had a sub who travels building to building to cover classes. Okay, we got a teacher, I'm assuming here. She returns from a leave of absence and her doctor states she can return to work, but recommends the employee to only work at one building instead of the 5 in the district. This request would limit her exposure to germs. Is this a valid request? So let's flip this a little. Any request is a valid request. The question is it an undue hardship? I can't answer that without knowing more. My guess, if we are talking about a large school district here, and you have sub shortages, as all school districts do, my guess is this might be reasonable, because you could say, okay, you know, we have enough work at building A to cover a whole day for her. That might be true, right? And therefore that could be reasonable, and we can reassign people. Now, schools usually have unions too, so you have to look at this in terms of, would that sort of violate any collective bargaining agreement terms? And if it's a problem, you actually have an affirmative duty to talk to the union about sort of massaging that a little bit to let her be different than everybody else under the ADA. But I wouldn't say it's unreasonable out of hand. The question is it reasonable? The other thing that sort of, limiting the amount of germs by only going to one building. My husband's a teacher. My experience is every single building is as germy as the next one. I really question that. I'm not a medical person, but I question that just from sort of a common sense. How is that? Maybe that might be something we want to investigate more at our expense as to whether or not we think that that's a valid request. But I would look at that. So I'd be looking at how much work do we have in any one building? Can that occupy a full day for her? Do we have any issues under our CBA if we are unionized? And I suspect as a district, we might be. If we ultimately said, hey, we can't cover this, we would be looking at saying, all right, other options could include a leave of absence, another one. It could include reassigning her to a different duty. There's other things that we would look at to say, what is a reasonable accommodation here? So I don't know with the information provided if we have enough to say yes or no to this. My gut reaction, based on the limited paragraph here, is I'm going to bet if you're a 5-building district that you have enough work in any single building for her. And that if we think this request makes sense from a medical perspective, which is hard for me to judge, not being a medical person, this might be something we accommodate, assuming we can work it with the union and stuff. Okay, I hope that helps a little bit. I definitely would not dismiss it out of hand. I would go down the process of the interactive process and start talking to them and looking at that. Okay, another one. We have an employee who pulled their back taking out the garbage. Does that now constitute a disability? Is it the employer's responsibility to now recommend FMLA? So you as an employer want to run things concurrently. So the employee, you have enough knowledge now to say if this guy's missing time or this gal's missing time, to say, hey, Ann, come into our office, assuming Ann has enough hours in year or whatever, time in for the FMLA and say, hey, if you're missing time, here's the FMLA paperwork. And we may have other laws that overlap this too. If they're in the city of Pittsburgh or Allegheny County, we may be running that time concurrently, but it behooves the employer to run all time concurrently. So workers' comp is running with FMLA, any ADA leave, if we determine that, would sort of be running concurrently as well. City of Pittsburgh or Allegheny County, all that's running concurrently, because what you do not want to have happen as an employer is to say, okay, the guy's out on workers' comp for 2 months because of his back problem. He comes back and now his wife's had a baby and he wants his 12 weeks of FMLA and you didn't run the FMLA. You have a real problem now, because he's going to say he was prejudiced, that he didn't know that the FMLA was counting towards his 2 months of workers' comp leave. And he wants the full 12 weeks now to take care of little Junior and his wife. You want to run that so that you use up the available time all at once. Whether this is going to be a disability has to have some long-term aspect to it, right? I can twist my ankle walking out in the parking lot, but it's better in a week, maybe. Maybe the back gets better, maybe it doesn't. We certainly, if he's eligible for FMLA or she is, we should be putting him on it if he's missing work. Will this ultimately be a disability? Only time will tell. So it could be at when he's done with FMLA, right? And here again is where we have a paper trail. Just like the question that came in about returning November 26th, we never heard from them. At the end of an FMLA leave, a great practice is, like about 2 weeks beforehand, is to say, hey, Ann, we noted that your FMLA leave is up on whatever date. And we assume we're going to see you bright and early on, March 1st. If you have any issues, let us know. Now I've put Ann on notice that her leave is ending March 1st. We expect to see her back. She hasn't told us anything different. And this is her opportunity that if there's a problem, we're not leading with our chin, but we're sort of saying, hey, if there's an issue, let us know. You look so much better than just sort of terminating people. March 1st comes around, if I don't return, we may give me a second bite of the apple if we're sort of a kinder, gentler employer. And if I don't return, we're more hostile, maybe we fire me. But if I come back to you and there's 2 weeks left in the FMLA and I say, hey, I still can't return. My back, I'm going to have surgery. I'm going to be out another 2 months. We probably have a disability at that point because we've gone through 3 months of back problems. Now we have another 2 months of back surgery. I still can't lift more than 5 pounds, whatever it is. Now we're looking at whether or not a leave of absence is a reasonable accommodation under the ADA, a leave of absence that extends beyond the FMLA. And the answer to that is often yes. It depends on your size. It depends on what you've done for other folks in the past. But additional leave beyond the FMLA is often a reasonable accommodation under the ADA for a disability. So I don't know if this guy has a disability yet or not, or this gal. I think we're way too early if we haven't even started the FMLA to make that decision as to whether or not it's a disability. But we certainly have workers' comp, and we certainly, if they're eligible, have FMLA that we should start. So I hope that helps. Let me make sure I don't have any more questions here. Okay, I don't think I do. Just a reminder, March 19th in Cranberry, free lunch, 2 SHRM credits. What more could you want? And we'll talk about the executive orders from President Trump. And again, it's not political. It's not meant to be that. It's meant to be a discussion of how they impact employers. Okay, everybody have a wonderful Valentine's Day. Take care and try to stay dry in the rain out there. Thanks for attending.